So I've been asked a lot about different protein intakes, and in the carnivore nutrition space, people are saying you don't need high protein to be satiated, to get vitamins in, your minerals, to stay lean. And other people are saying, okay, you have to stay low protein, not spike insulin, things like that. Where do you stand on that? And do you think there's some kind of nuance between each of those points?
Well, sort of my view is that it depends on the activity level. I don't believe in low protein. I think that's a complete and utter nonsense to be in a constant catabolic state. It's just not a healthy way of being, because protein isn't just having a certain amount for muscle and bone tissue, the muscle skeletal. You still need for a lot of catalytic processes in the body, so enzymes, activity. And so that's something that actually requires a number of cofactors as well. So if you're under eating meat, the amount of B vitamins, the amount of micronutrients that you'll intake may not be sufficient. And it depends on the body size, the activity level, a lot of these things, how much you're going through those. There's a difference between somebody who may be, let's say, 70 kilos, 154 pounds, that's sedentary, and somebody who's highly active. There's going to be different protein requirements for those two people. So somebody that's sedentary, they could probably get away with about, the 1.8 grams per kilo or per 154 pounds, so times that by whatever it is per the pound. You have to sort of divide it, I believe, to get the pound. Let me just do that quickly. Top of my head.
Yeah, I'll chuck it on the screen as well.
So, so if we're talking about 1.8, divide that by 2.2, we're talking about 0.8 at a bare minimum per pound. So 0.81 per pound, which is the bare minimum, I believe, for somebody who's completely, couch potato, sedentary, does nothing. That would be, but even for somebody who's been sedentary, I would still recommend slightly higher than that, around 2 grams per kilo body weight, which if we take that amount, it's about 0.9 in the pounds. So that's what I would sort of would be my absolute minimal. I know that some people do say different numbers to be, bar's a bit lower, but I tend to, but from my own experience, see that most people do much better with a bit more protein. Just seems to basically have that better response. It's probably a genetic thing, the variations. So for some people it may, and as Bart would agree with me, there is no long-term research in this area to say definitively that 1.76 or which is his bare minimum, is the actual definitive thing. My sort of is 1.8. I just rounded off, but at the same time, I tend to say, because due to genetics, I would rather people are closer to 2 grams per kilo body weight, or 0.9. I tend to personally see that I feel much better, even in a sedentary state, being at 2.2, which is 1 gram per pound, or 2.2 per kilogram of body weight. I find that it works much better for me. Maybe it's my genetics, having slightly higher Neanderthal DNA, and actually I tend to become more muscular, and so I think my requirement for my frame is much higher in a sense. So that's the way I sort of see it. Now, that's not necessary for everyone, so somebody from an Asian background or African background or whatever may require the sort of levels closer to what Bart says and all that. But I think that if you're generally in your family, you tend to have a higher muscularity, I think you should go for that slightly higher protein because genetically that's what you've probably been adapted to. So that's sort of my take. If you're basically now more active, like you're doing sort of moderate to high or low high sort of things, I would go at least up to about 3 grams. And for, sort of the high level that where you're actually doing a lot of physical activity, like bodybuilders and people like that, I think that 3.5 to 4 is more ideal. Again, depending on the sort of genetics and what they're trying to achieve and all that sort of stuff. So that's my sort of numbers, the way I see it.
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. I liked how you touched on the point of like epigenetics as well, and perhaps where your background was, how your natural build is. Now, I've got a question linked to this about protein intakes as well. So I've had more luck myself following a diet with more dairy in it to get more protein. So that means either whey, raw milk, cheese, raw cheese, things like that. I seem to find that my muscle soreness is a bit less when having those things in. I think it's partly due to the leucine content. But do you find any kind of difference between protein intakes with people that perhaps have a very mixed carnivore diet versus a very simple sort of lion diet?
I think that generally a lot of people subscribe to the sort of lion diet for whatever reason. I tend to say that this is probably because the modern carnivore diet sort of emerged in North America primarily and became popularized within that sort of realm. And there is a very strong beef culture within that part of the world. And that's a modern thing. It's not an old thing. If we were to step back 100 years, we would see a completely different picture. We go 100 years or early part of the 20th century or late, or the 19th or 18th centuries and stuff like that. The only people that can afford beef are usually rich people because it's really hard to transport long distances and stuff like that. And so even in Cincinnati, you've basically got an area called, the whole city is called, has the naming and the nickname Porkopolis, which means the city of pork. So the key source of fat, because remember, you've got seasonal now starch. You don't have refrigeration. You don't have all these modern comms, nothing like that. So what is the most fattiest animals around? It's pork. So pork becomes a key component. And we see even in the Middle East where, due to religious reasons, that pork sort of excluded. It's probably because it fouls the waterways and stuff like that, and that is a very expensive commodity within an arid environment. So pigs are considered, are not an unclean animal and are not suited for that environment. And so camels and things like a certain type of lamb. And if you take a look at those Middle Eastern lambs, they've got these big, massive fat deposits on the back of the lamb. So there's a lot of energy there, in terms of mass energy, something that can be taken and converted through the mechanisms of the body. So that take that food mass and then turn it into ATP, which is the currency of our bodies. We don't want to upset Bald Man Bad by using the C word. But the key thing here is that people need to remember that used to be the primary history around the world. You go to China, pork was the main meat. You go to Japan, pork was the main meat. It got displaced later on, and that was after the Second World War. That was an anomaly. That wasn't normal. Pork was the dominant thing, even amongst all Japanese, not only the Okinawans. The Okinawans just had a certain type of pig that was different from the rest of Japan. But, they still they venerated the pig, little statues and all sorts of things. That was the main source of energy for that population. It was only after MacArthur, as the governor of Japan after the Second World War, because the country was depleted, the country didn't have resources or money. They had to find something, and they just built a massive fleet of ships and repurposed military ships into whaling ships and ships to basically go out there and actually catch whales and catch fish. And Japan ended up with a culture, which was heavy fish orientated. And that was a consequence of basically post-Second World War history, a bit like in Greece. Countries decimated, olive oil, is the easiest thing to produce really rapidly. So that's where all the investment goes through the Marshall Plan. So we need to keep that in mind, that things changed post-World War II, and that isn't the default. You've got to go back and look at history and look at the animals and look at what existed in those sort of areas. Greece, from ancient Greece all the way back from Homeric epics, is pastoral based, and it's dairy and meat, and it's primarily goats and sheep, but more goats than sheep. That's the dominant type of ruminant animals that you're actually, and pork is also very important. Let's not forget, the Spartans have all these wonderful pork dishes that they love. Well, apparently one of them where they use certain parts of the pork and certain herbs and stuff like that has an acquired taste. And the Athenians thought that the reason why the Spartans fought so much is because they don't want to have to endure so many years eating this stuff. So that was their excuse for why the Spartans want a quick heroic death rather than endure this sort of pork sort of soup that they had to consume. Anyway, it's a funny little thing, but a bit of history there. But these are the default foods that the majority of humanity consumed, because we only had seasonal starch. We only had seasonal fructose to fatten up and put on a bit of fat stores. So otherwise, we didn't have those things. And so as a consequence, those were the sort of the default energy sources. So we come to them, and if you just think about it, what does pork have higher? Well, it has higher thiamine. It has higher amounts of, niacin, which is the sort of precursor to NAD. Which without it, certain redox, reactions can't happen inside the body. So when I look at the actual pork in general, the composition of it, and then when you combine lamb and things like goats and stuff like that, you will find, more fatty acids, the essential fatty acids and stuff like that. So it has profiles which seem to be long-term more beneficial, I believe. We're not lions. We're a different type of predator in that regard. So we're confusing, there's this sort of, it's more the myth-making rather than really what humans consumed for many thousands of years, and what even, and sort of the animals that we used to also consume were extremely fatty in the glacial periods, talking about mammoths and stuff like that, which are completely different than many of the other type of ruminant animals we have today, both domesticated and wild. So it's a very different environment. So there's, and I think, and if I look at, there was glyptogons, these big fat things that looked a bit like a VW. So that's what they looked like, and that they were very slow. They hunted those as well in the sort of glacial period. So you're talking about very different sources of animals, and humans didn't actually concentrate on one specific type. And I think that was a good strategy, because you would get different composition of amino acids, fatty acids, and micronutrients by doing that. And I think that when you actually just focus on beef, you're going to be neglecting some of these other micronutrients. You'll get more iron, but you're going to be getting less of some of the other micronutrients in that regard. So, and then people worry about, not enough iron. Well, there's the other side of things. Let's not forget, taurine also helps to improve the homeostasis of ions in the body. So if you're eating enough meat, you'll get enough taurine, if it's freshly slaughtered, that is, obviously. And then that will basically then allow you to regulate your ions. So that's less of a problem that people make a whole lot of fuss about. So it's really the B vitamins that you're going to have different composition in the different foods. And that's probably an important part of diversification of animal foods, is in my personal. Plus, there are, the last couple of thousand years through domestication, there have been a number of adaptations on top of that, and so we've tended to basically do better with a bit more variety in the animal foods that we consume. Is from what I can see, my personal view. I don't think sugar has sufficient energy, and also fat is required for a lot of things: structural materials, hormones, and also furnishes far more ATP. You can get 36 to 38 moles of ATP from sugar. One molecule of fat, you're going to get up to about it's a rough, as high as 460 8 molecules of ATP you'll get out of, but that's, so in terms of both energy density and the furnishing of a whole lot of other things, animal foods are going to be better. And I think that there are two things that people neglect in our community. It's either they neglect fat, or they neglect protein, one of the two. It's sort of the crazy thing. And I mean, there's been a few people recently talking again about GLP-1 and issues of insulin suppression, nonsense of this sort, that's still doing the rounds. And, we need carbohydrates and we need to be more like Paul Saladino, otherwise we're going to go to hell. I go, well, just eat more protein. That's the thing. See, the thing that actually raises GLP-1 more than anything else, it's not glucose. It's actually protein. If you eat sufficient protein, you will raise GLP-1. You'll also provide enough insulin signaling. And the other thing is that is really important with these sort of things. And he actually talks about a recent guy that he's actually who's one of those lean hyper responders. So he doesn't have any sort of like severe inflammation or anything like that, but certain enzymes in the liver are up, which are involved in gluconeogenesis. And he's going, well, he's producing. I go, well, the reason is quite simple, and the reason why these enzymes are up is because he's not eating enough fat. He's eating meats that are too lean, and he's got very low body fat. And most of our ancestors coveted fat. They were not ripped. That's a bodybuilder mentality. That's wrong. So all these other markers are fine. The only marker that's actually out of range, are these liver ones, which are elevated due to gluconeogenesis being upregulated. And he can't put enough muscle on. Well, you can't put enough muscle on because you're not eating enough, and you're actually converting a lot of that protein into sugar and then into fat, and that's why you're transporting more trigs. So if you're taking that, doing gluconeogenesis, Now, gluconeogenesis is an expensive thing. That's another myth, people need to realise, because gluconeogenesis, you're basically, there's hydrolysis that's actually happening. And so, we have two types of enzymatic things that happen in our body. There are the things that are called endogenic reactions. That means they require a lot of energy. And, gluconeogenesis isn't one of them. It's the exogenic. That means, if you graph it, an endogenic reaction would be something like that. An exogenic reaction would be something like dropping off. It don't require a lot. So what these enzymes do is, I'll give you an example, for instance, without getting into so you'll basically take sort of, if you're taking, I think it's pyruvate, ATP, GTP, and water, H2O, and that you can convert to, and this is through hydrolysis enzymes that are using water to, so if you're reversing glycolysis, then it would be very expensive, but you're not doing that. You're sidestepping that process, where it's, the pyruvokinase sort of pathway. You're not doing that. And so you're doing this sort of, these enzymes use water to alter those sort of structures. And so you can actually take that and actually then, and you'll actually, I think it's orthophosphate, which is a PI, they call it. And it just basically, that will come through from the GTP to GDP, and it basically neutralizes. That's when you're ripping off that nitrogen. And so you're able then to, by doing that, then you've got the carbon backbone to be able to then convert it. So then it's much easier. So then you just need the water molecules, because, to the carbon backbone, you're going to be attaching pretty much, hydrogens, which is then you're going to be modifying it to be able to produce the glucose. So then that goes to, from memory, I think the molecule is, what is it again? I think it's PEP, which is part of that final part of that sort of glycolysis path. It's an enzyme. It's an acid type thing. I'm trying to remember. Can't remember exactly the acid, but you basically, that ADP. So because it's reduced, ADP, because you've ADP, and then that the orthophosphate, which is also that deactivating, because you've taken off the nitrogen. And so then you've got GDP, PI, and then you're left with, I believe, 2 hydrogens at the end. And so from there, there's another enzyme step that will actually take that and convert that to fructose 6-phosphate. I think that's, no, it's not. No, it's the PI version. Anyway, I can't remember it exactly. And then from there it goes on through another. It's these 3 hydrolysis sort of low energy enzymatic steps that basically then will go to all the way down to fructose 6-phosphate, because the other one's fructose 1.6 something, bisphosphonate. That's it. Bloody, I'm trying to remember this sort of stuff. Memorised it ages ago, but and then that will actually then convert down to fructose through another, plus water, and that through another hydrolysis step that will actually convert down to fructose 6-phosphate plus the PI, because that's a mouthful as well. And then after that will convert down to glucose 6-phosphate, and from glucose 6-phosphate you produce basically glucose plus the PI, the orthophosphate. And then you're back to, through these enzymatic steps, which are using water, and they're very low energy sort of reactions. You've basically converted that amino acid all the way down to glucose in very simple steps, which don't require a lot of energy. So it's not an expensive process at all, is what I'm trying to say to these people, that it's not an expensive. But if you don't give the body enough, you're going to be in a sort of a state like starvation. And this is what this guy is. So this guy's in a state of starvation. The difference is he's not basically breaking down his own muscles because he's eating the protein. If you, a starvation person actually will elevate the same enzymes. It's simple. It's because you've run out of stored energy on your body. You're too lean, mate. And, Cyrus, he doesn't get it. And I'm going, this is the problem with when you go through medicine and you go through and you do introduction to biochemistry and physiology, and then you get into pharmacokinetics and doing pharmacology, how drugs that work in your body and react, and you do basically surgical techniques, and that's all they bloody learn from then on, and their mind is just, they've forgotten most of the other stuff, and then they try to come out and act as experts in physiology and biochemistry, and I say, well, leave that to people like Bart who understand it much better than you, mate, because you're getting it all wrong, And as I pointed out in the previous video to him, I said, well, if you take a look, calcium, because you could have that 24% of people that have got the calcium issue. Calcium also, if you don't have enough, you could raise glucose in your system. But also, there's a thing of it'll raise GLP-1, glucagon, like peptide 1, and so will high amounts of protein. So if you're not, depending on your genetics, not getting enough of either one of those, either from the meat directly or because you may have the genes not getting enough in the diet as well, because you can't get extract sufficient from, because of the pathway being down regulated genetically, then you're going to have a problem with that. And you can't blame the diet for not eating appropriately to your species appropriate or to your genetics, which the last couple of thousand years of adaptation. And this is where the ignorance of these people, then they come up with this bullshit, just add carbs in and that will fix your problem. And I go, no, that's not a good idea. Why would you want to add high deuterium foods, highly inflammatory foods, or engaging in the Randall cycle? That's not a good idea as a solution to raise, so-called suppressed insulin. What a load of nonsense that is. You've got suppressed insulin, mate, because the body's trying to basically produce as much glucose as possible because you're lean as fuck. Pretty much, you're so lean, you need to basically, you're up-regulating to the hilt gluconeogenesis, because everything else is normal. It's just all the pathways for gluconeogenesis, and then producing from that excess glucose, producing fat in the liver and exporting it out as trigs, as VLDL, and you basically the last thing as you move through the ideal LDL, what are you going to end up with? Massive amounts of LDL-C, because there's hardly any of the other trucks, the chylomicrons, because it's not coming in. You're not eating fat sufficient to bring that energy in.
Go.
And that's the problem, that why people face these issues. It's it's the consequence of being too lean and being more like those people in Africa when they were starving years ago, remember? They pretty much were eating their own fat, and the same enzymes were being upregulated. I mean, George Cahill did the studies back in the 70s from Harvard University, where he did all the, the stuff where put people in ketosis and put insulin straight into them, and they were fine and all that, and did all those sort of experiments that you'd never get through an ethics committee nowadays. But he looked at all this sort of stuff and saw all these. If anybody goes back and looks at George Cahill's research, they will realise that if you're too lean and you're not getting enough, you will see the elevation of these enzymes. You will see the increase of gluconeogenesis. You will see the increase of triglycerides. But if you put enough fat in it, or you've got slightly more body fat, you won't see that. So it is the consequence of being too lean. This whole bullshit about insulin suppression doesn't exist. It's a myth created by Rob, pretty much. It's a friggin' myth. It's basically a person being in starvation state of fat. The person is so lean, they don't have enough fat to basically produce the hormones. That's why his testosterone's in the toilet, and to basically why he's going like ape shit in basically producing so much glucose, through gluconeogenesis. I mean, that's the only thing. And if you don't eat it, you're going to get it from the body. No wonder he can't put on muscle. He's eating a whole lot of lean meat, trying to remain lean and cut and all that, so he can go to his mates, look at me, I'm lean, I've got a six-pack, touch it. Ridiculous. The modern influencers and the modern idiots on YouTube and other social media that think that is the ideal. You know yourself from the bodybuilding sort of, when they get off after competition, they are so friggin' ravenous because their body is so low, depleted on energy. All their hormones are in the friggin' toilet completely, and they are ravenous like dog shit. They will eat anything you could throw in front of them. They will, devour it like they're, like a python on heat.
Yeah, I've been there lots of times, Harry. I mean, amount of times, I think the last competition I did, I was like 4% body fat. And that night I pre-booked like a Chinese to come to be delivered. It was like 4 meals worth I had. Then I walked down to Tesco Express, which is a shop near me. I bought a tub of ice cream, loads of those mini Cornetto sort of cone ice creams. Then I was putting chocolate sauce all over and all that sort of stuff. Bear in mind, I was up to that point, I was clean carnivore for like
exactly. Yeah.
I don't know, months and months and months. I was so hungry.
I say to people, if you're that lean and you want to fix this problem, engage the Randall cycle for a small amount of time so you can actually rapidly restore some body fat on you. Because being too lean is very unhealthy, as Bart would say, extremely unhealthy. This is the reason there is no suppression of insulin. That is a good thing. You want insulin to be in the toilet to be able to provide you with enough glucose to basically keep the whole system going, because you're not providing enough food. It's a strategy by the body built in conditions of starvation of energy. This person is starving of energy because they don't have enough on their own body and they're not consuming enough. That's the problem.
Build muscle and lose fat on the carnivore diet.